come from very far. He's been traveling the world, right? Dr Kamugisha, who I'm told, he told me this morning he was born in Tanzania. Whereabouts? That's right.
Morogoro.
Morogoro, yes. It's a very nice place. I remember many years ago. He was born in Morogoro, but he grew up in the West Indies, and of course he's a West Indian scholar. I'm told he did his PhD with Dr. Kamugisha,
Yes, indeed.
whom people know for his book on Fanon. So we have already established a link. Aaron has edited a whole bunch of books here. He's actually a senior lecturer in cultural studies at the University of West Indies, Cape Town, which is in Barbados. And he's working on a study of coloniality, citizenship and freedom in the contemporary Anglophone Caribbean, it says. And I'm reading here, mediated through the social and political thought of C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter. He's the editor of Caribbean Political Thought, The Colonial State to Caribbean Internationalism. So I think there was a copy of that here. No, this is another one. Caribbean Political Thought, Theories of the Post-Colonial State in Caribbean Cultural Thought, From Plantation to Diaspora. This is the one. Very big. And most recently, Caribbean Popular Culture, Power, Politics and Performance. He's also on the editorial board of Small Axe. Some of you might know it's a brilliant academic journal from the Caribbean, with very, very interesting debates and publishes very, very interesting stuff. And today, he's going to talk to us about this very long title, The Area of Experience that we term the New World, introducing Sylvia Wynter's Black Metamorphosis. I mean, what's particularly interesting, I think, inviting someone like Aaron is that I think there are major areas of similarity between Caribbean intellectual experience and our African and South African intellectual experience. Not least, of course, the constant having to address the problem of colonialism, neocolonialism, the history of dispossession, and in their case, slavery, which was an overwhelming determinant of their culture and tradition. So welcome. I don't know how long you want to talk for. I haven't asked actually. Do you want about 45 minutes?
Yeah, probably 40, 45 minutes.
40,
After that, I get
45
bored hearing myself speak. Yeah.
Good. That's good. So after 40 minutes, I shall stop you, and we will take questions from you. Thank you very much.
Just give me a 5 minute and you don't notice. Alright, so I'd like to say thank you very much, Michael, and thanks a lot to Richard for inviting me. I met Richard at a conference in Barbados in 2004, and I've not seen him in person again until about an hour or so ago. But this is my second visit to South Africa. I was here in 2012. I was trying to come across also and have a conversation with you then, but I just simply could not extend my time out of South Africa and in South Africa any longer. So this is my first time over at Rhodes, at Grahamstown. Thank you so much for inviting me. Coming to South Africa, of course, is also special in many ways. I was born in Morogoro, Tanzania, 3 days actually before the Great Soweto uprising in 1976. So coming to South Africa is always special, partly because for people of my generation in the Caribbean, we came to consciousness in our very early teens through the last stages of the anti-apartheid struggle. So simply just the incredible calypsos, the sounds, the activism, everything that was taking place there really gave us a particular connection to anti-colonial struggle, to black struggle at that time. And I still remember, I didn't attend because I was too young, the incredible rally that took place after Mandela was released from prison in 1990, in which something like 10 to 15% of the population of Barbados went to that rally, okay, to celebrate that. So that's my context for being in South Africa. I'm going to be speaking also at the University of Cape Town and Wits while I'm here. And thank you very much for inviting me and for coming, especially at a time in which I know there's so many important events that are taking place at campus right this very moment. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. Now, the subject of my talk is a very fine Caribbean intellectual called Sylvia Wynter, who more and more people are starting to know more about, especially since there's been a great deal of publication of her work and work on her work in the last 2 years. She was actually 88 years old yesterday. She is retired emeritus from Stanford University and lives in Oakland. She was born in Jamaica in 1928. And she has been increasingly recognized as perhaps the greatest living Caribbean intellectual whose work has found its way to us through non-fiction philosophical writing. Ever since 1968, she's been publishing a series of path-breaking essays on the Caribbean and Black intellectual life. But the focus of my study is this tremendous unpublished manuscript that she did in the 1970s, which is called Black Metamorphosis, New Natives in a New Land. And I'll talk more about it, or the whole subject of my talk is about it, but just as a preamble in terms of how I discovered it. I've seen references to it. I finally managed to get hold of a copy through Paget Henry in about 3 or 4 years ago. And when I joined the editorial board of Small Axe in 2013, David Scott said, well, you know, I asked each of my new associate editors to do a special issue of a journal. So what do you want to do a special issue on? Anything you want. And I said, okay, I'm going to do a set of critical responses to Black Metamorphosis. It's the current issue of Small Axe. It was published just about a month ago. And what I basically ended up doing was I persuaded 6 or 7 of the top people who write on Wynter in the world to read a 954-page manuscript and then write an article thinking about it and thinking about their own work in concert. And very persuasive, okay? Because to get anybody to read anything that's 900 pages long and then write on it, it really is more, of course, a tribute to the incredible reach and importance of Wynter's work than my own persuasive skills. But somehow it happened, it came out, and I invite you to have a look at it so you'll see more context of what I'm going to discuss from here. So I titled the essay Introducing Sylvia Wynter's Black Metamorphosis. And that's because the manuscript, of course, is unknown. And part of what I do is the intellectual history of it, and then I'll speak about some of the very specific ideas that Wynter brings to us within this manuscript. So to begin then, in 1971, after meeting at a conference at the University of the West Indies Moore campus in Jamaica, the Jamaican cultural theorist, playwright, and novelist Sylvia Wynter wrote African-American historian Vincent Harding of her intention to write an essay on the African experience in the Americas for publication by the Institute of the Black World. Now, this conference was the ACLALS conference, which is the Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. And it was held in the Caribbean for the first time. And it became this incredible critical event within Anglophone Caribbean literary criticism. And it was also part of a series of events in the late 1960s and 1970s that made the University of the West Indies Mona campus a very charged and unsettled and very productive intellectual space, which it isn't now in the same way for reasons that we can discuss later. So you had in about a span of about 6 or 7 years the emergence of the New World Group, which is a major group of Caribbean social and economic thinkers, questioning and thinking about how to consider Caribbean economies in a decolonized age. The rise of Black Power in Jamaica, the occupation of the Creative Arts Center, and Walter Rodney's mesmerizing impact, which was curtailed after less than a year. The short story of this is that Walter Rodney arrives in Jamaica in January 1968 to take up a post as the first lecturer in African history at the University of the West Indies. And in October 1968, he attends a conference in Montreal. And when his plane lands back in Jamaica, the Jamaican government said, oh no, you are banned. We don't want you here anymore. Okay? In 9 months, he caused so much trouble that they banned him. So there's a lot to aspire to you for any of you all who want to take the same pathway. But that was Jamaica and Mola campus at that time. And of course, there were a number of critical journals, most notably a Ben journal and also the journal Safaku under the editorship of Campbell Brathwaite, which at that time had begun the critical labor of sketching the contours of what would be a Caribbean literary and aesthetic tradition of criticism. Now, this particular conference, ACLALS, was very remarkable because it was a conference in which some of the simmering debates within Caribbean literary criticism got exposed on the world stage. So basically, the Caribbean literary critics invited the Commonwealth Language and Literatures Association into their house, and they then proceeded to air all of their dirty linen in public and have a lot of public fights among themselves at that time, while everybody was there like, what is going on? So you have a whole set of irreconcilable polar opposites taking place. The idea of the responsibility of a Caribbean intellectual versus a disinterested writer, which was part of a polemic between V.S. Naipaul and Campbell Brathwaite. And then the whole idea of the allegiance of literary criticism of the folk, which versus the Leaviside criticism, which is represented by Sylvia Wynter versus Kenneth Ramchand. At that time, so Wynter plays a very important part of that conference. And at that time, she's a lecturer in Spanish in the Department of Modern Languages at UE. And she's a noted novelist and playwright in her own right, and a significant Caribbean cultural theorist. However, when she speaks to Vincent Harding about her work for the Institute of the Black World, she decides, you know, I want to do something new at this point. I actually want to write an essay that moves beyond the fact that I've been talking about the Caribbean and talking about the Black experience in the Caribbean, and I want to write a more hemispheric essay about the weight posed by colonialism on Black culture. And she says she wants to do this, but as it happened, it was supposed to be an essay, and in its first form, it's a 40-page essay. But then it expands more and more, far beyond its authorial intention, and it becomes Wynter's major project for the 1970s. And in its final iteration, becomes a 935-page essay. It's never published by the Institute of the Black World, partly because by the early 1980s, the Institute of the Black World is suffering all of these financial difficulties in Atlanta and organizational difficulties. And only one small part of it is actually published, an essay called Sambos and Minstrels, which is published in the very first inaugural issue of the journal Social Text. Okay? But if you read a number of Wynter's other writings in the 1970s, you can see allusions to different parts of the manuscript, even though you can't take one part of the manuscript and say, okay, well, that's a published verbatim from it. So, why this interest in the text from 40 years ago? Well, I think that Black Metamorphosis, New Natives in the New World is a remarkable manuscript and deserves close study for a number of reasons. It is, I would argue, the most important unpublished nonfiction work by an Anglophone Caribbean intellectual. It's also a major guide to the transition Wynter saw between her work mainly on the Caribbean in the 1960s to her work on Black America and then her theory of the human in the 1970s and 1980s. Because Wynter leaves Jamaica in 1974. First she goes to the University of California, San Diego, where she works with people like Frederick Jameson and others. And then after that she goes and takes a post as chair of the African American Studies program at Stanford University in 1977. And then she stays there until she retires in 1997. So for people who are already familiar with some of Wynter's work, what Black Metamorphosis does is it gives a very important bridge between one set of writings and the other set of writings. So it's almost the equivalent of when they discovered economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, and everybody's like, oh, we understand Marx in a different way now. That's the effect that this has for Wynter. So it's her most sustained, but it's also her most sustained discussion of the politics of Black culture in America. So it is a major intervention as a text in which a West Indian intellectual is thinking about what it actually means to encounter the Black American space. And in terms of reflections by West Indian intellectuals on America, the only text of its own nature I can think of is American Civilization by C.L.R. James. But American Civilization is a very different kind of text, and we can also discuss the similarities and differences in question time. So Black Metamorphosis, partly because it's written by a Black Caribbean intellectual, but it's really mainly concerned with the African American condition, is one of the most compelling interpretations of a Black experience in the Western Hemisphere ever written by a Caribbean intellectual. Because what she actually manages to do is give this incredible sustained rendition of the Black experience of New World coloniality in African diaspora letters. In my opinion, it's one of the best that's ever been done, and to even say that is not quite enough. So what I want to do from here is move into a discussion more centrally of the text, or of aspects of the text. And I start with this particular quote from it. It was a pain, the angst of those posited as non-norms that compelled examination of the functioning of the symbolic order itself. Sylvia Wynter commences Black Metamorphosis with a declaration that its intention is, and I quote, to explore the historical process, the socio-economic sea change, the cultural metamorphosis by which the multi-tribal African became the native of that area of experience that we term the New World. The daring and breathtaking scope of the statement announces the text devoted to wide-ranging socio-historical transformation across the centuries and a cultural history of the African presence in the New World. The wonder that this might be attempted at all by Wynter can be partially explained by the historical conjuncture through which this work started. Within 5 years of the first programs in Black Studies at US universities, in which the responsibility to disenchant the fictions of the Eurocentric Academy and to produce new knowledge in search of human freedom was an urgent task. Black Metamorphosis will undoubtedly give scholars of the African diaspora studies much to consider just based on two of its central themes, and those themes are her theories of cultural transformation in the Americas and the related perspective of the question of indigenization, which she is positing as a process through which people of African descent become native to their new land. However, what I believe gives its text its most enduring power is the idea that Black experience matters and is decisive in comprehending the New World. As Wynter claims in that very first line that I read, that Black experience is a distinctive area of experience unparalleled in the past history of humankind. So Black experiences are crucial, as without it, the ideological fictions of a contemporary New World order that consign the vast majority of its population to a subhuman status remain uncontested and grow every generation with weight and power. And in her meditation on Black experience, which spans 900 pages, she has all of these theoretical speculations on social, political, and aesthetic features of Black life. She inaugurates a number of key terms and extends other ideas, all considered around this question of Black existence. So she has a number of phrases or terms that she inaugurates. She talks about nigger breaking. She talks about the underlife. Indigeneity I've also already mentioned. She speaks about the non-norm, or the category of the non-norm. Plantation archipelagos, marginal archipelagos, the colonization of consciousness. And all of these are rendered into a manuscript which has a conceptual reach across centuries, leaving no sphere of modern existence, whether it's political, social, economic, religious, or cultural, untouched. And if we turn to Fanon for a moment, Fanon will tell us, ontology does not permit us to understand the being of a Black man. For not only must a Black man be Black, he must be Black in relation to the white man. The Black man has no ontological existence in the eyes of a white man. And we know that these words are from the 5th chapter of Black Skin, White Mass. And we also know that the literal translation of that chapter is the lived experience of the Black, because the translation of Black Skin, White Mass is, really in vogue, is, we know, a bit of a modern tragedy, but I'm sure many people have spoken about that here already. And one of the remarkable things about Black Skin, White Mass, of course, is the fact that it's this journey of feeling an event in an anti-Black world. And it's one of the most searing descriptions of its kind in Africana letters, a reflection on invisibility, hypervisibility, and Black embodiment, which has rarely been surpassed in poignance or in influence. But this journey of the idea of lived experience to Fanon, as Lewis Gordon has recently shown, and I'm talking about in Fanon's, in his recent book on Fanon, came through Simone Beauvoir, who in turn was in debt to Richard Wright, a path not without significance for Wynter's Black Metamorphosis. Because for Even though she consults many texts, as you can imagine, in the process of doing this work, she keeps returning to Richard Wright's Black Boy. And it's this particular text that allows her to theorize a transition away from a Marxist-determined theory of black liberation to an illuminating, even though it's somewhat unfinished, schema where black experience determines any conceptualization of black past and black futures. And I don't know if anyone here has read Black Boy by Richard Wright. Familiar with it? Well, you've read everything, I think, Richard, yes. But there's this moment in Black Boy that particularly captures Wynter's attention. And it's a terrible scene of repression and victimization of a young Richard Wright by his white co-workers, Peace and Reynolds. And in her initial discussion of this, Wynter suggests that Peace and Reynolds' racism is secured by economic considerations, given force by colonization. Okay? So at first she says, devaluing black labor meant a relative overvaluation of their labor. And that's a particular economic consideration. But later in the manuscript, in the development of this argument, the economic motive becomes secondary to a consideration of what she terms a pathology of whiteness, which itself is a cousin to the pathology of a colonizer in the bourgeoisie. So the behavior of Peace and Reynolds is an illustration of their desire for racial mastery. That demands recognition from blacks. It recalls in for us Hegel's ideas about lordship and bondage, but only if threaded through a Fanonian gaze. Because while Wynter is not going to dispute Irene Gensier's assessment of the influence of Hegel's work on Fanon, she's also going to say the following. If Hegel's influence is central, even more central is the ground of Fanon's experience of being black in a white world. In other words, the non-reciprocity of signification is the foundation of a settler-native division. The master-slave model is essentially, for Wynter, the norm-non-norm model. And the way out of what Fanon called this infernal cycle is not the security of negritude, as he so well showed in the lived experience of the black. Writing in the 1970s, Wynter understood this very well, but she insisted on the productive resistance that negritude offered to global cultural blanchitude, and consequently a subversion of the non-norm, of the norm-non-norm model. So she offers what we will call a very partial defense of negritude. And it's here that we have that quote from Wynter. It was a pain that obstacles posited as non-norms that compelled the examination of the functioning of the symbolic order of knowledge itself. And this constant fashioning of blacks as a non-norm, what Richard Eiton would once call their persistent status of outliers to the modern state, demands centering the experience of coloniality rather than class domination as key to the other practices of society in the Western Hemisphere. Because really what Wynter wants us to think very deeply about is black suffering. And black suffering, as we all know, is an overlooked phenomenon in the contemporary world, since blacks are consistently blamed for all of the problems that black people have. It's something which, of course, is angrily denied by many, is a victim to a version of historical amnesia and bad faith that we term anti-black racism. And this long and sustained agony of black experience, Wynter is going to claim, and keep in mind that Wynter is writing this in the 1970s, is going to find its zenith in a contemporary site which combines terror and captivity. And of course, Wynter is thinking about the ghetto and the prison. So Wynter will say the following. The ghettos and prisons of today's North America are the new forms of a plantation archipelago. The new forms of a plantation archipelago are not, as were the old forms, the sites of a system of industrial colonization, but rather reservations where those now inscribed as expendable by the system of production can be herded, to repeat in contemporary terms the protracted agony of the American Indian. And of course, in this comment, she anticipates by 2 decades what is going to become termed in academic and activist circles as a prison industrial complex. And this particular comment, of course, is as prescient and revelatory as her search for anti-colonial process, which could hasten its demise. And here she would say the following. It is the natives, all the wretched of Europe, who, breaking out of their reservations, are now called upon to reinvent the very concept of the human through a restructuring of the world system created by the discovery and conquest of a new world by the West. This is Wynter writing in the 1970s. And as we know, the uprising that Wynter thought was possible in the mid-1970s never came to pass. The specter of the neo-colonial dominance of 40 years later was close to unimaginable at that time, and the corresponding tremendous and dreadful rehearsals of the socio-economic conditions of black people throughout the world. And this is not just, of course, unique to Wynter. In an interview, of many interviews that she's done, I remember Angela Davis in Race and Class in 1998 stating that if you had told me that there would be 2 million people locked up in prison in the United States today, when I started the kind of work on prison industrial complex in the 70s, I would have told you, you are crazy, this is impossible. It is not possible for this to happen unless America has overtly descended into fascism. Okay? Well, there we have it, 2 million people behind prison in the United States. And in this particular manuscript, Wynter has a suspicion of the impending doom to come. I mean, she spent some time speaking about the 1978 Regents of University of California versus BAP decision in the US, which is a very important Supreme Court decision, and it was one of the opening salvos against this whole, against civil rights, which of course is going to reach a crescendo in later decades. However, Wynter also proffers a very prescient understanding of just how challenging the struggle to subvert the status quo is going to be. And she suggests that central to this is the social dominance of the bourgeoisie. Okay? And I move on from here to a section I call the bourgeoisie sublime. Now, in the process of writing Black Metamorphosis, as I alluded to earlier, Wynter gives upon her earlier conviction that the primary factor for the consolidation of white supremacy in America was a series of economic forces unleashed by colonialism and transatlantic slavery. Early in the text, white terror upon black bodies is figured as a disguise through which an ideology based on super-exploitative labor relations masks itself. So she actually is going to say early in the text, racism was in the last instance determined by the profit motive, end quote. And this is her preliminary analysis of racism. And she actually will go as far as to say that cultural racism plays an economic role. However, even when she says this, because one of the fascinating things about the text is the way that you can see Wynter actually thinking through her thoughts, revising them, and coming to a different conclusion a couple of hundred pages down, if you stick with the text. Even though she's saying this at this point, there are all of these caveats. The dialectic of the African as native labor, the status of blacks as property rather than a class excluded from bourgeoisie property rights. And midway through the manuscript, in a very arresting paragraph, she actually repudiates her earlier convictions. And she moves from the theory of a black stereotype as a mechanism to facilitate the production of a super-exploited population to this stereotype as intrinsic to domination throughout the system. And this requires more than slightly stretching marks in the colonial situation, as Fanon once noted. However, Marx is decentered but not abandoned, as he's key to the target of Wynter's critique in the last half of her text, and that the target of her critique is the social dominance of the bourgeoisie. Because while Wynter cites approvingly Marx's famous dismantling of the legitimation tactics of Western bourgeoisie, and we will recall Marx's famous comment about the insipid childishness which is preached to us in the defense of property, the drama of coloniality for Wynter requires a critique beyond even that imagined by Marx in his exposure of the social reorderings and upheavals unleashed by capitalism. For Wynter, the power and effectiveness of the bourgeois order was that it ultimately allowed for the self-expression of no other group except under the condition that the group expressed itself in bourgeois forms. It guaranteed freedom of expression was limited to the freedom of bourgeois expression. That is to say, it imposed a form of its expression on every other form in its vicinity. Bourgeois hegemony, then, is no idle phrase, as by its nature the bourgeoisie must be culturally totalitarian or cease to exist. Comprehending race, this means, for Wynter, appreciating the fact that all racisms are finally bourgeois. It is a bourgeois social order that needs a fixed, rigid individual to separate itself. The tactics of force and consent, cooptation of vicarious identification result in blacks workers and women being intimately interlocked in a system in which their other, respectively white, middle class, and male, constitutes a normative identity, a central feature of the bourgeois mode of domination. The aspirational quest for whiteness and attendant betrayals of the black bourgeoisie within the system are thus for Wynter to be expected. By the conclusion of the text then, Wynter is going to reverse what she's saying earlier, and she's going to say then, the particular wrong of the black, his total social exploitation, cannot be fought except if it is fought as a general social rather than the merely economic wrong that it is. Rather than an area of experience that may give a universal paradigm similar to the proletarian experience, dominant understandings of the black experience in the US for Wynter portray it as a racial experience. And this is something that she would argue against, because she's saying that the black experience shows the inextricability of the infrastructure and the superstructure. And the black revolt is thus the most radical revolt because it aims at the code of the very system. The black presence in the New World is thus subterranean, but it's omnipresent. It is fugitive, but it's hyper-visible. It is condemned as a non-norm and a non-person, but it's also the foundation of a concept of free citizenship in the Americas. Think of the Haitian Revolution, for example. The monumental importance then of this area of experience that we call New World is that the black code is the central inscription and division that generates all of the other hierarchies. The secret of capitalism, then, Wynter is going to say, is to be found not in the factory, but to be found in the plantation. This allows then her to resolve not only a theoretical tension within her argument, but to extend her thoughts deeper into the meaning of black experience mediated through culture. She thus would propose that we substitute the concept of a colonization of consciousness rather than alienation. Because she says the black person who accepts himself as a Negro is not colonized, it's not alienated, he is colonized. There then, the essential theoretical model for our comprehending the dynamic dialectic of terror and hope that constitutes the history of blacks in the New World must lie in black experience itself. And Wynter then goes on to say several poignant and important things about desire, because she says that desire plays a very crucial role here, both as an analysis of colonization and also as a way of presenting the pathways of assimilation and resistance, which in different iterations remark the hallmarks of black social and political traditions. So she refers to what she terms the carefully cultivated sentimental passion of the bourgeois cult of feelings. And she says that this is a corollary of the realm of desire of the European humanism that Fanon, of course, would denounce so spectacularly in his conclusion to the Wretched of the Earth. Black Skin, White Mass, which she returns to many times in the text, opened the theory of the exploration of a central strategy of bourgeois domination, a strategy of the imitation of desire. The coloniality of power through desire is revealed in the following statement. It is through the totalitarian colonization of desire that bourgeois hegemony activates its strategy of power, end quote. Simultaneously though, black culture is going to produce heretical ways of being capable of dismantling the entire bourgeois mode of being. So the year of spirituals that for Du Bois, if we think about his Souls of Black Thought, awakened Du Bois to the gift of black culture to humanity, is a powerful expression of uncolonized desire. Black music in the late 20th century would become a commercial anodyne, but with its Janus face of subversive desire. And here Wynter will say the following. It is in this decolonization of consciousness, this degradation of social fictions, that links the collective popular black culture and the theoretical formulations of black intellectuals. Black music from blues to jazz to soul and its multiple derived variants counters the social fiction of managed organizational capitalism that the consumption of more and more consumer goods is a goal-seeking activity of man, one that diminishes pain and increases pleasure. And I'll go on because the quote continues. Rather, black culture sings, as it has always done, of an absence, a lack of happiness, an absence felt in the flesh, and occasioning a radicalization of desire that secularizes utopian longings, the kind that cannot be satisfied by the dominant social order. Under the commercialization of the music, it infiltrates this radicalization of desire and exists as a leaven of a society at a mass popular level. So